Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Social Media. I am Professor Cyrus Satzes. Why don't we get right to the lecture and the topic at hand? Today we're going to be talking about news and social media and how the two intersect and converge in a lot of ways, and also how social media became a source of news for not just this country, but really the world. Um, so let us get started. And I'm going to start this lecture first by covering a couple of important lectures in the world, or I'm sorry, covering a couple of important theories in the world of mass communication. And those are agenda setting theory and gatekeeping theory. Those are two of the three prominent theories associated with mass comm, and they pertain directly to social media, and I'll explain why in just a moment. First, the definitions, so you folks can get a better understanding of what these theories mean exactly. Agenda setting theory, and the scholarly definition, is a transfer of salience from the media agenda to the public agenda. In layman's terms, the media agenda sets the public's agenda. What this means is that we as a society often determine what is most important based on what the media tells us is most important. A recent example of this, for example, could be a few months back when the Taliban took back control of the country of Afghanistan. This was global news. All everyone was doing was talking about this, and people prioritized that. People often had genuine concern for the people in the country of Afghanistan. Today, I never hear that country's name referenced anywhere. I have no idea how the people of that country are doing. I don't think many of you do, unless you are stringent consumers of international news. But it's certainly not headline news anymore, and so it's no longer a priority for us. The COVID-19 pandemic, if the media did no reporting on it, chances are most of us wouldn't even know it existed outside of a really nasty strain of the flu that constantly is going around that people will talk about. The point is that the media sets the priorities of individuals based on how they deliver the news, where it's delivered in terms of the pecking order of importance compared to other things. So in social media terms, for example, if you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, Facebook, any application that has a trending section, oftentimes what is considered to be most trending is prioritized. And the people consuming this in turn oftentimes think, wow, this is really important because it's what's trending. It's what people are talking about the most. In reality, might not be the case, but media organizations and individuals who are social media users are oftentimes dictating based on, again, how it's presented and who's delivering the news, are dictating the priorities of society. The media has that much power. And the agenda for each individual organization is very different, obviously, right? And oftentimes a profit motive determines that. Gatekeeping theory, on the other hand, references the individuals or organizations who control the information that's disseminated to the masses. The scholarly definition is there are forces which may either constrain or facilitate the passage of news items through what's called the gatekeeping process. In layman's terms, the mass media whittles the large number of available messages into the select few offered to an audience. What this means is there can be thousands upon thousands of events going on around the world that could be deemed newsworthy, right? We can't fit all of those into our daily lives. So certain individuals that we consider gatekeepers are the ones who determine and decide what should be newsworthy and what isn't, right? So this chart, for example, shows you nearly all of the major power players in the United States that control the media. All right. There's a few missing here. And this chart is a few years old now, but now I don't see the year here for when it was published. But this chart basically shows, for example, Fox, right? And actually, Fox's bubble shrunk because Disney bought a lot of their media properties. What's missing up here is Meta, right, which owns Facebook and Instagram. What's missing up here is Snap, which owns Snapchat. What's missing up here is Twitter. What's missing up here? We have YouTube, which is owned by Google, or I'm sorry, Alphabet, which is the parent company. Um, I don't know if Netflix is up here, but almost everyone else is. And altogether, you can count maybe 20 to 30 bubbles total. Each bubble represents a media organization. And that's who's controlling and who's setting the agenda for all of us. And these are the gatekeepers. Now, you can call a gatekeeper, for example, a CEO, like an executive, right? You can also call a gatekeeper a journalist. You can call a gatekeeper a web designer who actually designs a web page and decides what's on there, right? Because that's setting an agenda there. So we'll get into more of that in just a second. But first, you need to understand who journalism is for and why journalism is so important. The primary purpose of journalism is to provide citizens with the information they need to be free and self-governing. The news media helps us define our communities, create a common language and common knowledge rooted in reality. What we deem reality is based largely on what we consume through the media, and especially mobile devices and social media in this day and age, regardless of whether or not it's true. But we can't be everywhere all the time. So this is what we have to deal with. It identifies goals, heroes, and villains. When you think of heroes, you oftentimes think maybe of like a firefighter or a soldier, or maybe a volunteer at the local animal shelter. It totally depends. Very subjective. Um, but we wouldn't know about their actions without the media. And the same goes for villains. Whether you determine a villain as being a terrorist, for example, or you determine a villain as being a developer who wants to pave over open space and take away uh, the home of wild animals so that a few luxury homes can be built. Again, it totally depends, but we don't know these things without the media telling us. Journalists identify a common base of information so that the reality we conjure in our minds, in the world around us is based largely on media consumption. It gives a voice to the voiceless, and social media has really changed that. Because now every individual can actually have a voice. Doesn't mean that everyone's consuming that voice, but at least everyone has the voice. And an example of the voiceless could be anything from children, could be the homeless, could be animals. Animals are a great example because even now animals don't have the intelligence to use social media. So you need journalists to be the voice for them. And it amplifies the conversation of the people. So journalists serve, first and foremost, the obligation is to the truth. This first loyalty is to citizens. It must provide a forum for public criticism and compromise. It must strive to make this significant, interesting, and relevant. That's a huge challenge for journalists. It must keep the news comprehensive and proportional. And that's where great writing comes in. And as practitioners must be allowed to exercise their personal conscience. And that's especially applicable to social media because of the amount of revenue that influencers need. And oftentimes they're swayed by business interests. Or if you're a journalist, let's say working on a story about Toyota trucks and their brakes not working. What if Toyota was a sponsor and your editor came to you and said, yeah, we make a lot of money from this company, so let's not report hard on them. Well, you as a journalist, again, your first obligation is to the truth. Your first loyalty is to citizens. So you must exercise your personal conscience in deciding what stories or you are going to publish yourself. And this also is very applicable again to social media. And again, the journalism's first loyalty is to citizens. They have a social obligation to the public, to the community, and the world at large. Journalists must gather news and information. They must synthesize it and distribute it so that it meets standards of fairness and accuracy. And the distribution part, especially, is where social media comes to play. Journalists also oftentimes are using social media to find story ideas, to determine what they're going to write about and cover. So that is where the argument can be made that social media is an agenda setter, because what is discussed in social media, whether it's a trending section or whether it's a viral post or whether it's a very influential individual and what they're discussing, oftentimes sets the agenda for what news organizations and the gatekeepers within those organizations are deciding to actually report, right? So social media has a massive part in all this. And journalists have a responsibility of practicing good journalism so the news organization can remain in operation, right? I mean, a journalist's credibility is their livelihood. And if you're a bad journalist, you're not going to continue working for that operation because they need to keep making money. It's also worth noting in this day and age, and this is a very important lesson for this class, So many people nowadays are consuming their information strictly from social media. The problem with that, if the information is not from a legacy news source, a legacy media news source, is that most likely the information is not peer edited. And that is the value of traditional news media organizations. That's what we call legacy news, like a TV news station, like an ABC News, for example, or a New York Times, a newspaper. They have multiple sets of eyes reviewing the content, editing the content so that it is valid and that it is trustworthy. Whereas if you're just watching and consuming your information from a YouTuber or from an influencer on a social media platform, what they're reporting very likely was not edited, peer edited by other individuals. And that is what organizational news sources do provide, is peer edited content. So it's more likely to be factually correct and less likely to be biased in the process. And journalists must foster and promote the idea of an open society where information flows freely and people can think and speak creatively among the diverse number of voices available. And that's where social media really lends a hand in providing a voice and allowing information to flow freely. Certainly a positive there. Now, before the internet became commonplace, the gatekeepers of information were very standard, right? You had editors of newspapers, you had executive producers of TV news stations, you had directors, you had executives, program directors who ran radio stations, you had publishers who decided what books were published, and you had journalists and you had broadcasters. And then the internet came. Yeah. But social media did not become a thing. So there was like a good 10 years there where you had the internet, where you had browsers. You might have been using AOL way back in the day, but social media was not really prevalent. So you had some new gatekeepers at that point. You had web developers, you had bloggers, and to a lesser extent, you had people leaving those comments at the bottom of news stories, right? That was the first time individuals had a voice and organizations paid attention to how popular that was. And that is what led to social media. When organizations saw how popular it was for people to actually have a voice of their own, to maybe contradict the original source of information, right? Like, let's say a journalist writes a story, someone can actually start going down there going, I call BS on this, or maybe they can add more information to it. The point is, it was wildly popular for individuals to suddenly have more of a voice. And organizations and certain web developers, certain coders, certain software developers realize, wow, so if we make platforms where each individual has their own voice, this could be something. And it was something. It led to social media. And with the rise of social media came the rise of user generated content. So who's a gatekeeper of information now beside all those that I just mentioned a moment ago? You. Time magazine in 2007 said you were the person of the year. You control the information age. Welcome to your world. So the citizen suddenly also became a gatekeeper, and the citizen also became an agenda setter, as I just mentioned now just a moment ago, and I'll get into that again in just a second. One concept to learn in this class is disruptive technology. A brilliant media scholar in Europe, Christensen, defines disruptive technology as a technology so different, and I apologize for all the background noise there, technology so different that it allows a new population to access a product or service that had been previously in the hands of the few. Examples include the movie industry. You originally just had movies on a big screen, then you had, actually before VHS, it was beta tapes, then VHS, then DVDs, then Blu-rays. Now everyone streams their films, right? So bookstores, for example, were very prevalent. Now they still exist, but they're not like they once were. And ebooks and e-commerce replaced them. They disrupted them. Record stores used to be very prevalent, whether it was like a Tower Records or like a Virgin Megastore. And then iTunes, Pandora, SoundCloud, Spotify, all these platforms that are online that stream eventually replace them, and record stores no longer exist. Or at least they mostly don't exist. There's still probably some around. And then computers disrupted the publishing industry, right? People actually used to use typewriters once upon a time. And the media industry has been disrupted by social media. And the rapid rise of social media is fascinating. Whereas it took 38 years for radio to reach 50 million users worldwide, it took 13 years for TV to reach that mark. The iPod, remember that thing, rest in peace, took 4 years. The internet took 3 years. Facebook took just 1 year to reach 50 million users, and Twitter only took 9 months. I guarantee TikTok took way less than that. So social media's rise has been incredible in terms of pace and influence. So when we ask the question in the social media landscape, who's the gatekeeper? Is it the organization? Like, is it Twitter, for example, or is it the users? Well, the answer is both. They're both gatekeepers. And as we've learned, the organizations are also gatekeepers because sometimes they have rules of their own. They do censor individuals. People have had their Twitter accounts and their other social media accounts banned for life. Think of our former president as one person. So they are a gatekeeper too. They are making decisions that influence the media we consume. Now, one thing that's important here, and I'm going to also there's a separate video that accompanies this. That social media, when it started to rise, wasn't originally looked at as a source of news and information. People used it primarily as an entertainment platform. But in 2010, there were a series of uprisings and protests that we call the Arab Spring. And this occurred in the Middle East and various North African countries such as Egypt, Syria, and Libya. And whereas before, when there were attempts at uprisings, when there were attempts to circumvent, or I'm sorry, when there were attempts to perhaps overthrow a government or at least protest, in wrongdoings by a government, they would usually quash that right away. And oftentimes it was through brutal tactics like beatings and whatnot. Well, and they'd censor local media, so no one knew about it. In 2010, people started using their mobile devices and social media platforms like Twitter to actually show the world all the injustices that the government was doing in trying to protest injustice, which is what most of these protests were. And it got the world's attention. The world noticed, and the Arab Spring, at least for that moment, was largely successful. But more importantly, people started to realize, wow, social media could be used as a source of information and not just as a fun toy that I can socialize with my friends with. And that really changed the social media paradigm big time. Now, citizen journalism is a real thing that people use social media for, and the Arab Spring was a huge part of that. You had a lot of citizen journalists on the ground, and the definition of citizen journalism is news reported by someone not employed by a traditional news organization. So it's not just bloggers, right? And photos and videos are vitally important in citizen journalism because it establishes credibility. While it's very difficult for someone to trust you based on just your words, if you're posting photos and you're posting videos, suddenly you're actually showing evidence that is a lot harder to fake. I know you can fake photos and fake videos, but people can sniff that out in a lot of cases. And again, for a citizen journalist, that really establishes credibility because, again, it's people can see right there the evidence, and they start trusting you. And credibility is being established in the process. The London bus bombings of July 2005 is where the first Citizen Journalism Award was issued. It was the first time widespread use of citizen journalism content was used by mainstream media. And then in the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings, the news was first reported on social media based on people who were there at the scene. So what does it mean to have a web presence as a journalist? If any of you want to be a media professional someday, you all have to have a presence on social media. You do. You have no idea how many media organizations I've worked for where they rely and look at follower counts of prospective employees, your social media usage. So if you want to be a media professional someday, Twitter is by far the most popular platform for media organizations simply because you can post hyperlinks and it supports all platforms of multimedia. You can do photos, videos, text, etc. Um, and so I strongly recommend, if you're aspiring to be a media professional, develop your Twitter profile, because while TikTok is fun and it is popular, it's not necessarily looked at as a prestigious news platform, whereas Twitter, to a certain extent, is. It's taken much more seriously. Most content on Snap, it vanishes. Content on Instagram is mostly visual, although there's some news content there. And Facebook is very esoteric, although it is the most used platform still. Most people use it more so for interpersonal connections. Um, so, whether you're a journalist or even in PR, you must create a brand and presence digitally. This can be anything from like a blog. Medium.com is a great blog platform, by the way. A YouTube channel, various social media platforms, but again, Twitter is the most prominent. And when journalists have a web presence, there's a deeper, more candid connection to the community they cover. You can actually engage with the people in the community around you. Story ideas are identified, as I mentioned a moment ago. You have no idea. I advise student media as well. I'm a media professional now, and social media is so important now for discovering story ideas, for finding ideas to actually report on. And there's an increased level of transparency between the journalist and the public. And transparency is a core tenet of journalism. And it also identifies new sources or experts to consider. I do book guests quite regularly now through social media, not something I did 15, 20 years ago. How to make money in the media? Well, advertising still remains prominent, especially YouTube is a great example of that. Most social media platforms, advertising remains a prominent source of revenue. Classified sections used to be the number one source of revenue for newspapers. Craigslist wiped that out, and now Facebook has a marketplace. There's still subscription services, which remain very popular in this day and age. Think of like a Netflix, for example. And the direct threats to the traditional media business model include free information, right? This is where social media can be a negative. Digital recording devices, streaming, Craigslist, as I mentioned a moment ago, and a lack of adaptability. Technology is always going to be increasing. Times are always going to change. So if you ever decide to work in the media, or you do work in the media, prepare to adapt. It is part of the industry, and it is a necessity if you want to survive and, more importantly, be successful. And of course, blogs and other free content as well. So social media is clearly an agenda setter. These are examples of nonprofit media organizations, and studies have shown, and they've admitted themselves, that they oftentimes pay close attention to their social media accounts to decide what to cover for their news. Meaning that the users on these platforms are the agenda setters. It's fascinating. Um, and scholars were given access to the Rachel Maddow show. And results there from a study conducted showed a positive correlation between stories that were discussed on the show's Facebook page and the subsequent airing of similar stories on TV. The evidence also suggests that social media may enable many factors that influence both the media and the public agendas. So social media is a vitally important part now of the media landscape. So if you have a discussion post, if you're a student of mine, make sure you answer those questions. Otherwise, there will be more lectures to come. And thank you.